In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up the perfect paludarium for a small group of vampire crabs. It's the perfect setup for beginners or anyone who wants a really low maintenance ecosystem tank. For this project, I'm using a 45 litre 50 by 30 by 30 centimeter aquarium, which is about 12 US gallons. I'm also going to be using a homemade acrylic lid, but you can also use a front open style tank with doors if you like, though they are a little bit more expensive. To kickstart the build, I've placed in a rock wall which will separate the land from the water section. The front portion will be the water section and the back portion will be the land section. The golden rule for making a vampire crab paludarium is to follow the 80-20% rule, which is 80% land and 20% water. You can be a little bit more flexible in big tanks, so anything above 20 gallons or more, but for smaller tanks under that size, this is the golden ratio to keep for the best success. You can use any aquarium safe rocks for this, or even wood if you have a better supply of wood. Just make sure you don't pick anything that has too many tannins leaching out of it. It'll get a little bit annoying if your water is always brown. So for the drainage layer of the land section, I'm going to be using leca or leca. It's basically clay balls, which is my favorite stuff to use. It's cheap, light, and easy to come by. But you can also use crushed lava rock, gravel, or even some coarse sand, though those options are generally a lot heavier. They do work in a very similar way. When building up your drainage layer, plan ahead for the maximum water height and make sure that you have a gap between the top of the water level and the bottom of the soil layer. If you don't have a gap of at least a few centimeters, about an inch or so, the soil won't be able to drain properly and the tank will start to smell like a swamp and you'll have a lot of nutrient issues that will pollute the water and eventually kill everything living in the water. Vampire crabs don't need a deep water section, but it does need to be at least enough to cover their entire body fully to accommodate them when they are molting. So I generally go for at least 2 to 3 times their body depth with a little bit extra for safety to account for any evaporation that might happen. On top of the drainage layer, you will need to add a barrier material to stop the soil from mixing in with the water. There are a few different options you can use here: window screening, weed matting, and natural materials like coconut fiber. Lately I've been using a lot of coconut fiber because I bought a big slab of it, but you can use whatever you have more readily available. And if you do choose window screening or weed matting, you can use this stuff forever, so don't throw it out if you make a new tank, just reuse it. So my only dislike of using the coconut stuff, the cocoa background, is that it's quite hard to cut and it always jams up the scissors, and for whatever reason, knives don't really seem to work that well with it either, even if they are really sharp. Apart from that, it works exceptionally well as a barrier. Just lay it on top and then fill any little gaps around the edges with some of the offcuts you might have. With a soil layer, I generally use plain garden soil or potting mix as long as it's organic. It's super cheap, super easy to come by, and the vampire crabs live and breed very well in it. However, this time around I'm going to try something a little bit different. I'm trying a mix of equal parts clay, sand, and dirt. I recently read a research paper that went into great detail about the environment a couple of vampire crab species live in, so I'm going to try and replicate it for this tank. I'll leave a link to the research paper below if you want to read it. However, if you don't want to complicate things and make a mix like this, you can go with 100% organic fertilizer-free potting mix or dirt from the garden. It works just as well. However, if you are getting something from outside, just remember to be prepared for any potential pests because it's not a foolproof system. Since vampire crabs live in burrows in the ground, you'll want to make sure that the soil layer is as deep as possible. I generally aim for something around at least 5 to 8 centimeters or 2 to 3 inches. This is enough space for them to burrow into, but you can go as deep as you like if you have enough space in the tank. They'll dig as deep as they can if they have the space to do it. But being able to make any kind of a small burrow is all they really need to be happy and healthy. If you do plan on making a deep substrate, always remember that you're going to need a plant into it, so you need to have some space for the plants to grow and the top of the tank. For the plants in this tank, I'm going to be adding a single fern, a clump of Ficus pumila, and some moss. It's just going to be super simple and super cheap. However, the plant options you can choose are pretty much endless. As well as the plants, I'm also adding some cork bits and some wood I have from some other previous tanks. You can also get moss from outside, but again, it might come with some pests, so keep that in mind if you're planning on doing so. I generally soak mine in water for about 30 minutes, then let it dry out, and most of the critters will go away. However, again, it's not 100% foolproof, so that's just a risk you might have to choose to take or simply avoid. How you arrange everything in your tank is entirely up to you, just make sure you can fit the lid on when it's done. Thankfully, vampire crabs aren't destructive like a lot of other crab species, so how you set up things in your tank is pretty much how they'll stay, give or take a burrow scattered around the place. Now I'm just going to spray everything down to help the soil settle a little and to hydrate the moss. This clump of moss here is a little bit brown and rough looking, but I think it might make a decent recovery. To complete the ecosystem look, I'm going to be adding a leaf litter layer here to the exposed soil sections to help simulate the forest floor. And I'm using oak leaves for this since they are pretty common and easy to come by here. But since these ones are massive, I'm going to be chopping them up in the blender, and this makes scattering them around the tank 100 times easier, especially in smaller tanks like this. However, you can certainly use smaller leaves, or if you have a bigger tank, it's not much of an issue. If you want to sterilize them, you can boil or bake them to do this, but since I've already used moss from outside, there's no real point in me doing that. Now to add a little more moss to cover the last exposed bits of coconut fiber. Finally, we can add the water section substrate, and the best options are fine gravel or sand. I've opted for sand because I have tons of it, but generally gravel is a fair bit of a better option because it's easier to keep clean. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of dechlorinated tap water and leave the tank to sit for a few days, maybe a week, just to do one final check to see if this chip in the bottom corner is going to leak or not. During this time, I'm also going to be adding my cleanup crew, so springtails, earthworms and isopods. They're pretty much an essential part, and they'll help break down any waste or mold that pops up in the tank as it matures. For the best results, you should generally wait 3 to 4 weeks for your tank to cycle before adding your crabs. This will allow the water section's nitrogen cycle to establish and the land section's mold cycle to pass. So before we add the crabs, here's a quick look at the lid that I'm using. It's a simple piece of acrylic cut to size with a row of holes drilled around the edge for ventilation. I'm adding 6 vampire crabs to this tank, though if you're just starting out, I would highly suggest starting with 3, 1 male and 2 females. However, the reason I'm adding more in this particular case is because I adopted this group from someone who was getting rid of their tank, though I'm not entirely sure what species they are. They're still quite young, though the lady said they were rain-eye, but I personally think they might be something else, maybe tomato, though I won't know for certain until they get their full colour in about a month or 2, maybe a little bit longer. I'm also going to be adding some snails at this time, and some salvinia to the water section. These plants will help filter the water and remove any nutrients. That's how this ecosystem will work without having a filter or a pump. And the snails will multiply and become a good food source for the crabs as well. And if you have the space in a bigger tank, you can also add some shrimp, but the crab will try to catch and eat them, so keep that in mind as well. But from my experience, the shrimp are generally too quick and the crabs don't catch them very often. Now while we watch these little guys settle in, I want to explain a couple of things about heating, lighting and water changes, and to point you in the direction of some of my other videos that cover all of these topics and others in great detail. So for the heating, you're going to need to keep your vampire crabs between 22 and 28 degrees Celsius or 71 to 78 Fahrenheit. I generally use a small heat mat to do this. They generally only work to around 20 degrees Celsius. Any lower than that and they start to struggle a little bit, so you might need to look for an aquatic heater or some kind of a heat cable, or you can simply heat your room. If you do choose the option to get a heat cable, you might need to add it earlier in the process, depending on the type you choose. For lighting, it's really simple. All you need is an aquarium light, and you can set it for 8 to 10 hours at 100%, and your tank will do very well. Water changes are also super simple. Just do a 20 to 30% water change once a week or bi-weekly, and remember in that time just to keep an eye on evaporation. Generally, some seasons are a lot worse than others for evaporation. As for maintaining the rest of the tank, that's super simple. Just trim the plants when you see they're getting overgrown, and mist it occasionally when you see things are drying out a little bit. You can generally tell just by looking at the moss. For any other questions you might have, feeding, breeding, etc., you can check out my vampire crab playlist, which cover pretty much every question you'll have in a ton of detail, and you can find even more information over on my website. Anyway, that wraps it up for this one. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in another video. Cheers everyone.